Hello. So I'm back for part 3 of my favorite 100 books of all time. Um, for the last 2 or 3, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, I might end up doing 40 through 21, and then taking the top 20 and doing that in like 2 videos. But I would say, out of 40, the remaining 40, I think I have like 36 of those books or 32 of those books or something. So those I'm going to do in the other sort of format where I'll show off the books. But I was thinking I was going to be able to do that with this one, which is 60 to 41. But unfortunately I realized I only have about like 8 of them. So that's not going to happen. Maybe I have half, but I figured it was just going to be kind of boring to watch like a bunch of like superimposed images anyway. So I am going to switch format for the last 40, and like I said, I may do 40 to 21 and then 20 to 1, but I might actually split the top 20 into 2 videos because I know I can talk a lot. And then also, I'm sure Sir Chunk will want to be around for those. Obviously he doesn't want to be around for all 100 books. And, I would say probably as we get into my top 40, he's read more of what my favorites have been, because we were actually talking about how, like, I feel like I read a lot more. He watches a lot more movies, and he also goes back and, like, rereads the classics more than I do. Like, I was able to read a lot of them in school, and I read them on my own in school because, I would get like the lists and I would read them, or take them out from the library. But I don't necessarily go back. Like, if I haven't gotten to them at this point in my life, there's a lot of classics. There's other things I'm reading. I also read a lot more like, contemporary fiction, whatever's popular, sort of, I don't want to say like booktube and book talk kind of books, because I don't necessarily read them just because they're popular. I feel like I just generally, for a period of time, I was definitely reading like whatever the biggest books were, not, because they were the biggest books, just because I like to be sort of aware of the conversation. And like I said, I have a friend who's a librarian. So for a while, I used to, be able to see her pretty much every day. And when we did that, I would borrow books from her. We would talk more about books. I don't get to do that as much anymore. So, I guess I've slowed down, or I've kind of just started pursuing my own interests. And then I also, for a period of time, read like heavily in the YA. And, Sir Chong doesn't read as much YA. So, I did some like YA, like kind of book reviewing and so on. So, yeah, so anyway, so there's like more variety. So as we get into like the top 40, there's more crossover between our lists. I mean, some of his stuff has shown up on my list and so already, and some of my stuff, some of his stuff will also show up on later lists. But, there's more for us to converse about, than, some of these, like the bottom sort of half. But, I love a lot of these books. And so, again, they're not necessarily like the bottom half. They're just, they're not in my top 40, so they're kind of in like the second tier for me. But, I read a lot of books. And so, like, to have 100, even the 60 that aren't as popular, or 61, are still pretty, still pretty high up on my list. So, moving into those books. All right. So I guess it would be 60, would be The Pillars of the Earth by Ken Follett. And this is, if you don't know, it's a massive chunky book, about, building cathedrals in medieval Europe. And that does not sound interesting, but it's actually really fun. It's a very fast-paced book for, 1,200 pages about building cathedrals and covering about 1,200 years as well. Way more interesting than one would think. Really reads quickly. very engaging, and I absolutely love it. I mean, I highly recommend this even if you're not like a big historical fiction person. It's just written very, it's very accessible. The only thing I will say is that apparently there's like multiple books in this series, and I don't know that I'm ever going to go back and read more. I feel like I have read all that I will ever need in my life to know about cathedrals and how they're built, and I think that's going to pretty much do it. I mean, I've like read them. I've traveled to some cathedrals. I feel like I'm good. Like I have enough knowledge of medieval cathedrals and medieval cathedral architecture to probably last me a lifetime. So I don't know that I need 2 more chunking books that are like 1,200 pages each about cathedrals. Or about like the church's power in medieval Europe. So, not sure I'm ever going to go back and read anymore. And then the next one, very similar, is Bunnicula. And this was my favorite book series growing up. I think I read this in 3rd grade. We read it for school, and it's just, I mean, it's what it is. It's about a vampire bunny. But, like, the vampire bunny is, like, adopted by this family, and there's, like, a dog and a cat already, and they don't like the bunny because they can tell he's a vampire, and, like, everyone's like, why are they weird about the bunny? And then I feel like they, like, team up as a group, though, and, like, start solving mysteries. And my favorite there's, like, How Will They End, which is what my favorite was The Celery Stalks at Midnight. Also, an amazing title. Probably one of the best titles of books, like, ever. I mean, definitely, it's a kid's book, but it was fun, and I really enjoyed it as a kid, and I have not read these since, I definitely reread them, but probably in, like, 5th grade, so I could not speak to, like, how well they hold up. I assume they do, because they keep getting reprinted, and people seem to like them still. And also, how can you really go wrong with, like, mystery-solving vampire bunnies? Like, it's just, I feel like that's pretty good. Also, now in another similar, completely random combination, we have As I Lay Dying by Faulkner. And I know I talked about this previously. When I was a freshman in high school, in the middle of the school year, I moved like halfway across the country. And I moved from like a school that was very like traditional in terms of, like the course structure. And so I was taking, like, English 9. That was what we took, like, it was just, everybody took English 9, and we just got, like, the same curriculum. And the school I moved to didn't have English 9 and English 10. It was, you basically had to take X amount of credits. It was very similar to college in the structure. It was actually a really great school, but you just had to basically take random classes. And so I think at the time they asked me what I was reading when I had moved. And I think we were reading, I don't know if we were reading Gatsby. We were reading something like American Lit. And so they were like, oh, okay, well, we'll put you in American literature. And so I was put in an American Lit class, and they were, I would say, about a little more than halfway through As I Lay Dying. And again, I mentioned this in another video, so I could try to be quick about it. But essentially, like, the teacher was like, you don't have to read this if you don't want to read this book. I know you just started. It's really complicated. And I tried, and then it's the only book in my life I've ever had to use the Cliff Notes for, because I just couldn't get there. I was trying to keep up in the class. I ended up not taking the test on it. And then going back and rereading it that summer on my own, just to kind of try to piece together what I picked up in the class, what I got from Cliff Notes, and then what I could enjoy from just like reading it on my own time and my own schedule. But it's a very weird book to try to read when you don't have any context and you're trying to catch up, because, everybody's reading a couple chapters a night and I'm trying to catch up. And it's not a long book, but it's stream of consciousness, multiple perspectives and narrators, I think pretty much all in first person. And they're all in different timelines. So you could be reading like one character who's talking about something that happened 20 years ago, and then you're reading somebody who's talking about something that's happening now, and then somebody who's talking about something that's happening like 3 weeks from then. And it's very confusing. Also, it's very heavy on dialect. And on top of that, a lot of the narration is complicated. So If you've read this book, you know, but like basically it's about this woman in this Great Depression, this family in, I would assume it's Mississippi because it's Faulkner. But essentially she dies. Well, she's dying. And so like a lot of the book takes place as she's dying and then after her death. And they're building her coffin and she's watching them build her coffin. She knows she's going to die. And then they want to take her to bury her in like the town she was born in. And it's this like whole road trip with this coffin and it's awful. And it's like no one has any money and they can't get there. And it's like this really like hard route to get there. But every part of the narration, so it's like her husband who, it's like he's happy to like get rid of her because he's going to like get money for her like body, or like he has money saved up and he's going to buy wooden teeth or something. So he's excited. And then her oldest son who's like grieving his mom. So he builds like the nicest possible coffin he can. And then another son who's grieving her, but in like this really messed up way. And he's really struggling with the death. And then she has like her daughter who's actually like trying to get an abortion. And so like all these things are going on. And then she's dead and she's narrating. And then there's this one chapter of like her child who's, I think he's like 6, maybe 8. And so early in the book, there's a chapter where he's talking about he goes fishing with his dad or his brother and the fish dies. And then he's watching them like gut the fish like for dinner. And so that's all he knows of death. And so there's one chapter, it's literally that the whole chapter is my mother is a fish. Which again has all this context and like literary merit and value, but like, you know, I was like, and I was a young student because like in high school, because my birthday is towards the end of the year, so I was always like pretty much a year younger than everybody in my grade. So I was, I think I was still 14, I believe. I'm just trying to think, because I was like, yeah, I think I was 14. Yeah, I was 14, but I had pretty much just turned 14, and trying to make sense of this on my own. So anyway, but I love this book now, like, you know, and I've been able to luckily read it. I read it again when I moved back, and then when I was in college, I got to read it in an American Lit class, and so I've had like way more time, you know, more time to like really be able to dig into this novel, and I love it, and I liked it then, but yeah, so not an easy book to read on your own in high school, trying to catch up with everybody else. And then on the completely opposite end of things, what I was reading also in high school, and I easily read on my own, one of my favorite books from like that point horror, YA, early 90s, cheesy teen horror era was Prom Dress by Lil Litke. And I used to love this. I'd read it all the time. It was like the go-to. I would always go back to this one. It's just basically like multiple vignettes about this like girls who get this dress over like different time periods and like in different areas, and like they all die. It's nonsense, but it was so much fun and like cheesy, and I mean I loved it. And again, you know, there was no real YA in the like late 80s, early 90s, except for like this new kind of like teen horror thing that was starting, which was point horror. And then you had like the Christopher Pike and L.J. Smith and R.L. Stein, Richard Tankersley Cusick, even like Lois Duncan. And so those started becoming really, really popular. And so there became, you know, this huge like glut, I guess, of like teen books. So there's finally like a section in like the bookstore that was predominantly for teens. And then after that, you know, we get into, I mean, there were always like a few things. There was like, you know, Judy Blume was always kind of like in there, but it used to be considered sort of like children's, like older children's lit. And so this kind of, obviously you weren't going to want to have your little kids reading these because they were like more violent and people died. And so it kind of opened up this whole new like genre really. And then moving on from there, there's also from when I was younger, Where the Wild Things Are, which I mean is, you know, I can't really call this a novel. Obviously it's a children's book. I think it's all of like 12 words. I mean, the art's gorgeous and like the story's gorgeous and it's so meaningful. And it's just such a beautiful book. And, like, if you haven't read it, go read it. I mean, it's just gorgeous. And if you have read it, you know, because it's just such an amazing novel. I mean, not novel, not a book for children. But even as you're older, it's a great book. And then I loved Christopher Pike. And Christopher Pike was writing, you know, all that YA stuff. And then he also had a couple sort of, like, adult novels. And then by adult, I guess they just meant longer. I guess like a little more complicated, but not like that much. And so I loved The Season of Passage. It was like sci-fi horror, and it's set on Mars. And they're basically discovering that there was like used to be water on Mars. It's really interesting because like some of the science, like now, and I always think back to this book. But basically, you know, they were discovering there was this whole world there, you know, before, and it's like kind of, you get to see like what the world used to be and why it's ended, and it's like vampires, but like sci-fi, and then it's also like heavy on, like Indian mythology, not Native American, but like Indian, like Shiva and Kali and all that, and so, and like other Eastern sort of religion, philosophy, and I mean, really complex, I think, for like a silly kind of kids, well, I guess adult, sort of cheesy horror sci-fi. But at the time, I just thought it was fascinating, and it was one of the only science fiction books I ever liked. And it was also, like I said, horror. It just really, like, when I was young, I was so impressed by it. I just thought it was so interesting. And I mean, I've read it again since. I haven't read it in probably, at this point, probably like 20 years, but I've enjoyed it when I've reread it. And so, you know, I kind of do, I actually am really like hoping to get this again. I don't have it, and I'd really love to get a copy and reread it because I wonder if I'd still love it, but hopefully. So here's a little bit of a break into my Stephen King section. I think I've had some Stephen King, or if I haven't, I know I have other Stephen King, but these are two of my favorites, obviously. So we have The Long Walk, which is a novella, technically, dystopian, and I know Sir Chong talked about this recently, but basically people walk and then, like, they get killed off or they die, and, you know, because they can't keep walking, and whoever is able to walk the longest wins. But it's this very, like, I love dystopian stuff, and so it is dystopian, and there's just, like, some really interesting things. I mean, obviously, it's a novella, so, I mean, you could probably do a lot with this. I bet this would be, like, a really cool way. Like, I know Stephen King often, like, he doesn't like the adaptations of his books, or, but I think if he was involved, and, like, even if it was just from, like, a just kind of creative advising standpoint, I bet this could be a really cool TV show. I think they've talked about doing it as a TV show, but I bet it would be a really cool TV show. Especially because it would give, like, him time to kind of, like, build some of these characters more. So, because I think, you know, it's interesting, definitely, and, like, the world's interesting. And then Needful Things, again, these are two Stephen King that kind of play into some of my favorite tropes and, like, book, you know, story types. So dystopian, and then Needful Things is haunted objects, and I just love that. And so it's a store where, like, it's an old antique store, and all the stores are, you know, they have their curse, or they, you know, do things, they're magical somehow, they're evil or possessed, or, yeah, so I really like this. Also, it's very, I know, like, he does a lot in Castle Rock, but this very much has that, like, small town feel, and I always kind of like, when, like, the small town feel really works. And so then the next two, which I suppose would be 72 and 70, I think. Yeah, I believe so. Is Silence of the Lambs. Obviously, everyone knows Silence of the Lambs. They know the movie. And I did read this. I can't remember if I read this before or after seeing the movie. I feel like it was before, because I don't think I was allowed to see the movie until, when I was younger, I was only allowed to see movies that were rated R after my parents had seen them, and I don't think they'd seen it yet. And they eventually did let me see it, which is kind of weird because it is pretty dark. But I, you know, like everybody, I feel like for some reason there's this whole thing where, like, oh, you're 12, and sure, like, you can watch, like, a man who, like, kills women and uses their flesh to, like, make himself, like, a bodysuit of their skin. That's cool, as long as there's no sex. Like, that's really what it came down to. Like, they didn't care if it was violent. They just didn't want me to, like, watch anything with sex in it. So, and they'd always have to, like, watch it first to make sure there wasn't any sex. So I was allowed to see it eventually, but I think I read the book while I was waiting, and like, the book is really great. I mean, obviously the movie is great. But the book is actually, like, one of the ones that, it is a great movie, don't get me wrong. Like, obviously the movie is phenomenal, but I actually think, I always think the book is better, but even with such a great movie, I still do think, like, the book is worth reading, because there's, like, a little more to it, and, I think getting into Clarice's head is really interesting. So I loved the book, I loved the movie, so that's going to be on here. And then I have House of Leaves, and the thing with House of Leaves is it's like, I feel like you can't help but feel like you've achieved something by finishing this book. It's such a complicated mess of a book. And, like, sometimes, like, I get, like, a lot of people are like, oh, is that just, like, a gimmick? And it, to some degree, yeah, I guess it is. Like, does it need to be as complex and just hard to read and just such a challenge? No, I guess it doesn't. But it really does work. Like, this book is very, very creepy. But there's essentially 3 books to it. So there's this video about this house, and if you don't know, like, I mean, this is really a short kind of summary of it, but essentially there's this video of this man in this house, and the house is this creepy house that's, like, doing weird things. And then there's this professor, I think he is like, or a therapist or something, who's studying the video. And so there's his, like, research on the video. And then the third person is, like, this, I don't know, he's, like, a freelance editor or something, or he's also a journalist, and he's just, like, this, like, drugged out, like, alcoholic young guy who just, like, hits up bars and, like, tries to, like, have sex all the time, and, like, and it's like him talking about, like, reading and editing this manuscript of this, like, research paper, essentially. And in the research paper, he's describing watching this video, and then there's all these footnotes, because it's, like, the footnotes of the professor guy kind of explaining things from the video, and then the, like, editor or journalist guy who's, like, commenting on those, and then he just randomly goes off on tangents about his personal life. And so I think it took me, like, at least 4 tries. It might have even been, like, closer to 8 to actually get past, like, the first, like, 10% of this book. Because I kept trying, and I kept just being like, I cannot do this. I don't get it. I don't get what everyone's so obsessed with. I cannot, like, I kept really being into when I get to, like, the stuff about the house, I was like, okay, the stuff about the house intrigues me, but there's so much other nonsense going on that I just couldn't get to it. And then finally I was like, you know what, that's it. I am going to finish this stupid book. I don't care. I will, like, force my way through it. And I did, and then, like, all that other stuff works, like, by the time you finish it. Like, it all comes together in this just incredibly unique experience. And it's, like, it's really intriguing, because it's, like, you're almost, like, experiencing the story with these other people. And so it becomes this almost, like, visceral horror novel. So it's a whole thing. Like, but I mean, I've never been able to get it out of my head. Even when I, like, couldn't get past the first 10%, I kept thinking about some of the images in the first part of the book. And then, like, now, having read it, I've only read it the one time through, because obviously it is a whole process. But I've never been able to stop thinking about it since I read it. And, like, I've recommended it to people, and a lot of people give up on it, and I get it. But usually when people finish it, they're like, what was that? And it's a whole, like, just journey. And I feel like it needs to be on my list, because it's so unique and so, like, just such an experience, that I mean, I did love the book in, like, its own complicated way. It's kind of like Dickens. Like, you like it after you're done, and you don't necessarily enjoy the reading process, but you're glad you read it. But it's not Dickens, because, like, Dickens is mostly just because it's boring and it's, like, super dated, but, like, and he obviously was just trying to write long. This is just a whole thing. So if you've read it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you haven't, just buckle in. All right, so then moving on, we have Fahrenheit 451, also dystopian, which I love. And obviously Ray Bradbury is just a fantastic writer. There's really nothing bad about this book. I mean, there are parts I like a little less than others. Like, I do feel like there's, like, this kind of move at, like, one point, and partly in, like, at the beginning of part 3. So, like, the book's in 3 parts, but, like, only at the beginning of part 3, there's this, like, push to kind of be like, it's going to be an action thriller now. And it's been this, like, philosophical look at, like, storytelling and art and, like, our emotional response and what defines humanity. And it's all these, like, very, like, philosophical concepts. And then all of a sudden, like, there's this, like, short sort of action sequence. And it's not even long. It just sort of feels like, what is this? You know, why are we, like, running from, like, mechanical hounds? And that part just, like, always makes me feel like it doesn't belong in the book, because it's so beautiful and it's so meaningful, and, like, there's so much commentary about, like, existence. And then it just kind of feels like he was like, oh yeah, I should probably have some, like, pulpy, like, action in here. And so that part just kind of always made me go, but I mean, it's not, like, bad. It just, I think that takes away a little. And the other thing I'll say about this is, like, I think I love British lit more because it tends to be more miserable. And so, I mean, Fahrenheit is not exactly a happy ending by any means. And I'm not going to ruin it if you haven't read it, although, I mean, it's been around for, like, forever, and so you probably should have read it by now. But if you haven't read it, it doesn't end happy, but it ends way happier than the big dystopian novels from Britain. You know, so, like, your Brave New World in 1984 are so nihilistic and just like, well, it's dystopian, and you know what? That's it. Life sucks. The world sucks. Humanity sucks. Fahrenheit kind of leaves you with, like, well, the world can kind of suck, but also there's good. And, like, we'll rebuild and we'll make things better. And, like, we'll never give up the beauty of stories and, like, art. Whereas, like, the Brits are like, nah, you know, humanity's at a loss. It's a loss. Let's just, like, give up now. So I think that's, like, more my philosophy. And so sometimes I'm like, I love Fahrenheit, but I'm like, it's a little too hopeful. Which, again, is more of, like, you know, just because I'm, like, a pretty nihilistic person. And then also on this part is I love the Fear Street series by R.L. Stine. I know I've talked about them many times. I'm not going to say much. Yes, they're cheesy. Yes, they're ridiculous. Yes, the movie series was amazing, and I hope there's more. But, I mean, they're super silly. And, like, I already talked a little bit with, like, Prom Dress, like, why this was so important, this, like, era of, like, teen horror. But, I mean, they're just, and I know a lot of people probably younger than me, because he was writing Goosebumps and Christopher Pike was writing Spooksville. And those were, like, for, like, the younger audience when they were also working on Fear Street and the Christopher Pike sort of teen books. So I know a lot of people grew up with those books, and, like, I didn't because I was too old for them by that point. So to me, like, this was like the teen sort of version of it. And, I mean, they're just fun. They're like reading a bunch of, like, little urban legends, essentially. They're like nonsense, but they're a good time. All right, so we're going to move to 2 YA novels, but, like, incredibly impactful, emotional YA novels. Unwind by Neil Shusterman is a story about, it's also sort of dystopian, but essentially it's after the Second Civil War in the U.S., and the Second Civil War was fought over reproductive rights. And basically the treaty was that abortion is illegal until the child is born. But then if you don't like your kid, if they're like either difficult or you can't afford them or there's like something wrong with them, you can then unwind them, which is essentially like have your kid chopped up for parts. And then they can go to like other kids who need them or like just, I don't know, get used for other things, which is super messed up. But I mean, obviously it's like a commentary on, you know, like the logic and some of the arguments with reproductive rights. But I mean, so as a start, I mean, you already have like a really messed up premise. And so it's about this group of kids who are set to be unwound. And, you know, they're trying to like escape and not get caught by the government because the government's out to like get them. And, you know, they've been essentially signed off by their parents because one's like just like a difficult sort of rebellious kid. One is the 10th kid in the family. And so it's like a tithing. It's like a religious thing that they give up their 10th kid. And I think one's like an orphan that reaches a certain point and they're like, well, nobody wants you, so, you know, you have no purpose anymore, so we're just going to unwind you. And because they're like, once you hit a certain age, like if nobody adopts you and you don't have a family, you just get like put back into the mix, I guess, and then recreated. And I think like, I mean, like, it's not, they're not like, when I say unwound, like they're not taken apart because they're like androids, they're like humans, but it's like they like take apart like their body parts and like donate them to people who are sick or, you know, like, I don't know, I guess do research on them. I don't know. Like, I mean, it explains a lot of it, but obviously they're not going to answer every question. But so the book by itself, I mean, the premise is great. Like the story is super fun because it's like really fast paced and you're like, oh my God, are they going to escape? Are they going to get unwound? What's going to happen? But one character towards like the second, like 2/3 of the way through the book, you actually read like their mindset as they are being unwound. And it's seriously one of the most disturbing, intense things I've ever read in my life. And I mean, I've read horror, I've read like all kinds of twisted types of things. I've read some Chuck Palahniuk. I mean, I've read all kinds of messed up stuff. And this is one of the most disturbing things because he's like, I think, he is like awake through it all and until like, obviously they start taking his brain apart and then there's, you know, he can't process, but like you're watching like him sort of seeing this happen as they like take parts of his brain, what they're talking about as they're doing it. And I mean, I'm really grossed out by like anything medical and surgical anyway. And then like, obviously the whole context of it is just so messed up. God, this book is so amazing. Like it is, I know there's more in the series and like, I think I read the second one and it was like, whatever. But definitely if you like dystopian, it is YA, but like, it's great. I loved this book. And then another one, like I said, this is also YA, but it's really dark and very disturbing. This is On the Jellicoe Road, or I think in the US it's mostly just called Jellicoe Road by Melina Marchetta. She's Australian. And it's just actually really interesting because like I don't get a lot of like, you know, I love coming of age stories, and so I've read tons, you know, the classics, and then I read, you know, I've read a decent amount of like American YA or even like Canadian YA, and even like a little bit of British, but like I don't get a lot of like YA coming of age from Australia. So that alone was interesting because it's about these kids who are kept in like a school for like, I don't know if they're troubled kids or like abandoned kids or kids whose parents are like addicts or I don't know. So, but basically it's about this group of kids in this school and then also like just their lives. And it's like super depressing, very intense, just a lot of like, and I feel like it might be science fiction too. Like, I don't know. I can't remember. Like, part of me feels like it's not science fiction. And then part of me is like, oh no, it's like, it's meant to be real. So, because again, it's Australian, so I'm not 100% sure if the things that, like, feel kind of weird and alien, if they're science fiction or they're just, like, the way other cultures are. So, I mean, it's kind of described as, like, essentially, like, a boarding school, but it just feels odd to me. And again, this was probably more, it's not really science fiction or, like, historical fiction or fantasy. I think it's just because the boarding school structure is not something that is familiar, like, in my mind, because, like, so a lot of it I was, like, reading and I was like, this is weird, because this is not what I know. So I'm really, I don't know. I know a lot of people who have read it, do love it, but I don't know a lot of, like, I guess, non-Americans who've read it. So I'm curious, if, like, you've read it and you're familiar with, like, education and, like, group homes and, like, rehabs and how, like, things are set up in Australia, if this is, like, supposed to be historical / like, some kind of fantasy sci-fi, or if this is just how, like, life is. So anyway, moving on to, I think we're at 66. Yeah, I believe so. So we have A is for Alibi, and really it's just the Alphabet series by Sue Grafton. There's a couple books I really like towards the end of the alphabet. Like, I feel like I really liked X. I really like Q. And I know there was some, like, in the middle of the alphabet, but, like, I honestly struggle a little bit to tell you, like, which book is which, at this point. And because I've read them all. I read them in order. I read a few of them a couple times, like, when I'd, like, if there was too much of a gap between books, so I'd read, like, the last one I had read. But they're all really great. I know there were some I liked more than others. And a lot of that has less to do with the writing or, like, anything about the story. It's more just, like, is the crime interesting enough to me? So they're all different kinds of crimes. I mean, most of them, not most of them, but I would say probably about half of them involve a murder. And then other ones involve, like, fraud or, like, just, like, missing people. But essentially it's about this, she's not even a detective, she's a private investigator who works for an insurance company early in the series, and then eventually becomes, like, her own PI, like, organization. And then she's, like, friends with the cops, so she can get, like, detailed info from them because they know her. And so she's, like, investigating all these different crimes, and, like, people come to her with, like, your classic, like, noir detective kind of thing, except it's not noir. It's set in the 80s. It has never left the 80s because the first book, I think, was written in, like, the late 70s or early 80s. And so even though it took Sue Grafton, like, way longer to finish them, well, she only got to Y and then before she died, so they're finished. But we didn't get Z. Even though, like, obviously it took her, like, 30, 40 years to write the books, she never moved the character, like, out of the 80s. And so it's kind of neat because, like, eventually it becomes, like, historical fiction. But, I mean, it's a little procedural, but it's not too heavy on the procedural stuff. And, like, I'm usually not, like, a huge fan of that. I used to love, like, the Kay Scarpetta books. And those were, like, very, very, obviously, like, from a medical examiner's point of view. And then, like, some detective stories, but a lot of times they're, like, really wrapped up in, like, the cop, the process and the procedures of police officers. So it's a little, like, freeing because she's a private investigator. She doesn't get, like, bogged down by, like, things have to work a certain way and this is like policy and protocol. So she can kind of do things that are a little, like, probably unethical or not necessarily illegal, but definitely, like, not totally legal. But the character's really fun. All the side characters in the series are really fun. And just, I mean, it's just a really great series. I just enjoyed them a lot. I always looked forward to when they came out. And, I think a lot of those writers, like, from, like, that started in the same era, you have, like, Sue Grafton and your Daniel Steele and John Grisham and Stephen King and all those like really popular writers throughout the 80s and 90s. James Patterson, like a lot of them started writing like way too many books. like James Patterson writes a book like a week at this point, I feel like. And like Dean Koontz was just like, oh, I'm going to just like dump 15 books out a year. And even like Stephen King sometimes, like now he's like definitely calmed down, but for a period he would have like 2 or 3 books a year. Danielle Steele was like 6 books a year. I was like, all right, you need to calm down, Danielle. But like what I liked about Sue Grafton is like her books were pretty consistent. Like they came out generally about every year. Sometimes it was a little more than a year. Sometimes it was less than a year. So you end up with like 2 in a year. But they like, it felt like she wasn't like in a mass rush to like get as many books out as possible. Like she was like, I'm going to write A through Z and I'm going to take my time and I'm going to come up with a pretty good mystery. And I'm going to make sure it makes sense. And obviously like it has to also fit the letter. So like she'd have like F is for fugitive and like, I think she had like J is for justice, you know, and so, she always had to have some tie-in to like the letters. So, you know, I just thought that like they were good and then she was prolific without being like too much. So it was like a nice consistent series that I kind of miss, you know, because now I don't really have that. I don't have like a writer who like consistently puts a book out in a series every year or so. I mean, I'm sure there are writers who are doing that, but I feel like I'm so far behind on them. So, kind of hoping, you know, at some point I'll find one or I'll like read the first couple of the series and really love them and then be able to kind of go through this again. And I know I mentioned earlier, with Megan Golden, with like the Rachel Kroll series, I'm kind of thinking like this has the potential to kind of go in this sort of route, you know, to basically be an annual, you get your annual Rachel Kroll story and she's investigating another crime. And I really hope so, because I really need like that just kind of like nice yearly like check-in with like a recurring character and set of characters that you really start to love. And then in 65 is My Dark Vanessa. This book blew me away. I read this earlier this year, and it's about a girl who, when she was 16, I believe she was 16, when she was in high school, she had a relationship with one of her teachers, and she's now an adult. She's now in her 30s, and she has sort of like, she still kind of has a relationship with him. It's like very weird. Like they don't see each other that much, and then every so often they see each other, and it's like they try to like rekindle their relationship, and it's like not working, and she doesn't know why, and like she's definitely messed up, and he's obviously messed up, and but she still thinks of their relationship as like her ex-boyfriend, you know, just like this relationship she had when she was young. And then now he's actually being accused of sexually assaulting a student. And it starts to come out that, like, this is a pattern for him. And so she may have been the first. We're not always 100% sure if she's the first. But she wasn't the last. And, like, this was, like, a thing he would do. And so, and she starts to, like, look at, like, their relationship and be like, all the times that they've, like, tried to sort of rekindle things and he's just, like, not feeling it. And she's like, is it because I'm not 16 and, like, you have a thing for teenage girls? And, you know, and she starts to really struggle with their relationship because she's like, I think I was in love with him and I thought he loved me, but maybe it wasn't love and maybe it was abuse and, like, maybe he was grooming me. But she doesn't see herself as a victim. And so it's such an insightful look at, like, such a complicated thing because, I mean, obviously relationships are complicated. You know, in this case, you know, from an outside perspective, you're like, okay, he is abusing his, you know, his power, his position. You know, he should know better. He's an adult. He shouldn't be like, you know, but you can really empathize with her and, like, how she didn't think of it as, like, being a victim of anything. And now she's, like, being told she's a victim. And she's like, am I? Like, and then she's like, maybe I am messed up and maybe he did it to me, but maybe he didn't do it to me. And, like, why am I, like, why do I have all these traumas that I don't understand? And, like, very, very interesting and insightful book. And I just love that it doesn't it doesn't give you like an easy out, like you're reading it and you're kind of like, well, maybe they were really in love, and you're like, no, they weren't, and like, and like the first time they have sex is so disturbing because it's like clearly rape, and like you can feel how just like gross like the whole thing, and it's not graphic, it's just the way it's done is like she doesn't really want to, she feels uncomfortable, and he's like saying things that just, you're just like, oh my god, from like an outside reader's perspective, you just feel really gross reading it, but then at the same time, like, you can totally empathize with her and understand why this would like mess her up, but also like why she doesn't want to see herself as a victim, and why she feels like she did have like some agency in this relationship, and she still thinks of it as like her, it's like that she had some power in it, it wasn't just her being abused and being kind of groomed and led along this mess, and it's very, I don't know, like, it was very disturbing, but also I just thought it was so well handled, and it really makes you think, and like I said, I love that it's not like an easy explanation, and you can kind of, any of your sort of like preconceived ideas of this relationship, or of her, or of him, it's like, it doesn't make it easy for you to kind of just like, oh, this is this, and I just think that's really great. So the last four, so 64 of Wuthering Heights, by Emily Bronte, and obviously this is a classic. This book, I think it's a very much just a mood book. There's just nothing better than the mood of this novel. It's just so creepy, and like the setting is great, and the characters are so messed up, and it's just weird and just twisted and miserable. I just love it. And I remember like so many debates in my like British lit classes in college about like is Heathcliff like, I mean, again, is he likable? No, but like, is he also like tragic? Yes. And Catherine's just as sick and messed up, and they're all just awful and messed up people. And yeah, I mean, it's to me, it's like a perfect book. It's like a great setting, horrible people, super complex, like weird, messy story. And I just love those things. I love all of that. I love messiness. I love bad, horrible people, like, who just are total nightmares. And I love creepy, like, rainy, gothic, mood settings. And so, like, everything about this novel I just love. It's just perfect, like, for me. All right, and then I have Some Girls Are by Courtney Summers, and this is pretty much like, I want to say it's like your typical coming-of-age girl book, modern girl in high school. But what I really loved about it is it's kind of like Mean Girls without being funny, where, like, you're just seeing how, like, vicious teenage girls can be to each other. And I think it's the only book I'd read at the time, and I honestly think it still might be the only book that I feel like truly, truly captures just how brutal teenage girls can be to one another. And, like, I think, like, there's so much out there in media, especially in, like, books and movies, about, like, bullying for boys, and it's usually, like, in middle school, and it's, like, you're, like, you see it in Stranger Things, you see it in It, it's, like, and it's not even, like, a tough kid. It's, like, some kid who thinks he's tough, and, like, just, like, a bunch of nerdy kids, and, like, for some reason they're afraid of him, and you're like, why were they afraid of him? And he's like, give me your lunch money. And then this is, like, high school girls, and then you're like, wow, high school girls are so cruel and so vicious, and the bullying and just, like, the emotional torture they put other girls through. I just think this is probably the most authentic I've ever seen that captured. And, I mean, it's not a fun read, but I loved it. I thought it just did that so well. And, and it was just like, wow, girls are awful, and they can be awful to each other. And I think it's very insightful. Like, if you don't really, obviously if you weren't a teenage girl, or if it's been a long time, or, if that wasn't your experience, or just generally, but if it was your experience, I think you relate to it. And if it wasn't, it's a very insightful look into how brutal, girls can be to their so-called friends. And then in number 62, I have 13 Reasons Why, which also does some of what I said with Some Girls Are, which is showing some of, like, the brutality towards, like, girls and bullying, and, like, how emotional bullying, what it does to somebody. But 13 Reasons Why, obviously it's very controversial now because of the show. Love the show. Don't even want to get into it, because I thought, like, the show did a really good job of, like, putting you in the mind of someone who's suicidal, without, like, glamorizing it. And a lot of people are like, no, it's glamorizing it, but I don't think so. I mean, I think, like, if you watch that show and you thought, hey, this looks great, when you're watching, like, her mother, like, pull her, like, dead body out of a bathtub, like, honestly, like, I feel like you're maybe missing the point, because it's definitely not, like, glamorizing it. It makes it awful. Like, and I get, to some degree, like, people are like, yeah, but it's revenge because she's telling the story after her suicide, and so she's kind of getting the last word, and, like, and I get that, but, like, I think a lot of it's, like, things that maybe, like, people want to say and wish they could say, and so I get that, that might be sort of attractive, if you're struggling, but it is really a beautiful story. And I know there's some, like, stuff that's, like, gone on, and there's, like, some stories and rumors about the writer maybe not being the best person, and, like, some of that stuff, and I try to, like, avoid that as much as humanly possible, because I don't know him, and I just, like, don't want to put myself in that place, because, like, I like the book a lot, and I really need to, like it, and just, like, be like, yeah, he wrote a really good girl, and not because, like, he's maybe a jerk. But essentially it's about this girl who has committed suicide, and she has left 14 cassette tapes, which have 13 sides with recordings, and she's left them for a list of people, and essentially there are 13 reasons why she killed herself, or 13 people, essentially, and so each person gets a side of the tape. And so these go to this character, Clay, who was kind of like the one good person on the tapes. And it's, half of the first half of the book is like, why am I on these tapes? Like, he's like, I didn't even know her, and the little I did know her, like, I thought we got along, and it's somewhat like, you're like, oh, so that makes it easy, but it also does address the fact that, like, he really liked her, and he had, like, a crush on her, and he thought she was amazing, but, like, he didn't really know her, and she kind of was, like, really reaching out for somebody to, like, know her, and to, like, see her and hear her, and to truly, like, get her, and he just couldn't. And, like, I mean, again, it's not his fault necessarily, but, like, I do think it does a good job of being like, some of the things that happen to her are awful. I mean, like, she is sexually assaulted, and so, like, obviously that person totally deserves to be on the tapes, and you're like, yeah, okay, like, that is horrible. What you have done is, like, ruining somebody's life. You suck. But also, like, what I do like is, even though some of the things, if you take them individually, it's very easy to go, that's not that big of a deal. What are you getting upset about? Get over it. But what I think is really interesting is that, like, it shows you how, like, slowly little things just, like, pick away at you. And so even without the assault, like, you can see why she's slowly, like, falling into this, like, pit of despair, essentially. And so if maybe this major event hadn't happened, would she have committed suicide? Maybe not. Maybe that, like, was, like, the final straw, but also, like, maybe if the other things hadn't happened, the one horrible thing, she would have been, I don't want to say more resilient, but, like, better prepared to, like, still be able to get through. And so I just thought it did a really good job of, like, showing how much impact we have on one another, even when we think we don't. And, it's very easy, especially in high school, like, to, like, be very self-absorbed and to not think about the consequences of your behavior or your actions on other people. And, I mean, we all do it. But, like, what I thought was really interesting is how, like, she kind of talks about how things that people like, that's not that big of a deal. So what, that person ignored you? So what, that person wasn't there when you needed them? But how those things can, like, all kind of multiply into being, like, too much to take. And then especially when there's, like, a trauma. And so if you're already struggling to feel like nobody's listening and no one's there, and then on top of that, you're put through this horrible situation, it's very hard to really believe those last few voices maybe that are like, no, there's hope. And so I think, if nothing else, I really hope that, like, because it was so popular, it helps people kind of think about those things and, like, their actions, and maybe be a little, like, nicer to each other. But I know there were, like, 2 or 3 other seasons, and it was supposed to be, like, nonsense, and I didn't watch that because I read the book. I liked the book. I liked the first season that was based on this book. I don't need more of it. I don't think there should be more of it. I think they were talking about having a sequel, like, they had the sequel series. They were thinking about doing a sequel book, and it shouldn't. I mean, like, this is Hannah's story. It's about her suicide. I feel like that's it. Like, it's wrapped up. So, anyway, that's my feelings on that. And then 61, I have The Girl on the Train, which is Paula Hawkins, and this was, like, right in that era of Gone Girl, and it was, like, unreliable narrator, women who are kind of crappy people. That's sort of, like, the beginning of, like, the real push into, like, domestic suspense, domestic thriller. But it was such a great read. It's just such a fun read. It's fast. The characters are kind of messy. Again, I love messy characters. The mystery's pretty solid. And again, it's like 61 where, Gone Girl is going to be higher on the list because, like, it's a little more, like, standard. But I still think this is a fantastic book. And I think I'm the only person, or, like, one of a very small group of people who actually have liked, I haven't read Slow Fire Burning, but I did like Into the Lake, I think, or Into the Water. The other Paula Hawkins, I thought that was pretty good too. I mean, it's not as good as Girl on the Train, but I did really enjoy, the 2 books I've read of hers, and I have her 3rd one, which I do really want to read. But anyway, so I'm not going to have as much to say on that one because it's so popular. So, like, I mean, the movie was bad, and, like, I love Emily Blunt, but, like, just ignore the movie, don't see the movie, and go read the book. It's a whole other thing, way better. Obviously, I mean, books are always better, but it's way better done. I just didn't think the movie really captured any of, like, what I loved about the book. It was just kind of like, yeah, here's some of the plot points. But the book's great. Yeah, so those are my 61 to, or wait, 41. I'm totally backwards. I said that was 61. That should be 41, I believe, because this is 41 to 60. So, that's that middle of the top 100. And, like I said, I'll be back with the actual books for, I think, the last 40, because I have most of those, and then, Sir Chonk will probably pop in with some opinions. Yeah, so, that's those, and I'm not sure what you've read or how many you've read, but, always curious what you think, and if you've read them, what your thoughts on them are, if you liked them, didn't like them, want to read them. Obviously, I recommend anything on this top 100 list. But, I mean, clearly, it depends on what your reading taste is and what you like and what you're looking for. But I'm always happy to be like, yes, you should read this because, or if you have questions, to be like, yes, this is why I think you might like this, or why you wouldn't probably like this, and maybe don't read this one. But anyway, thanks for listening. Bye.